November 25, 1177. A 16-year-old king, his hands rotting from leprosy, his body burning with fever, stood before just 500 knights. Across the sand, 52,000 eyes stared back. Saladin's 26,000 warriors. Experienced. Rested. Certain of victory. What happened next would shake the entire Islamic world to its core, and no one saw it coming. God's fury, the day a dying king broke Saladin's dream. The throne of thorns. The Holy Land, in the year of our Lord 1177, was a kingdom held together by prayer and sword, and precious little of either seemed enough. Jerusalem was not merely a city. It was the beating heart of the Christian world, the prize that 3 generations of crusaders had bled and died to keep. Its walls had witnessed miracles and massacres in equal measure. And yet, in the autumn of that year, the kingdom built upon those sacred stones had never been more vulnerable. King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem sat upon a throne that no man envied. He was 16 years old. His shoulders bore the weight of an entire civilization, the Crusader states, the pilgrimage routes, the sanctity of the Holy Sepulchre itself. These were not abstract ideas, they were obligations written in the flesh of his ancestors and now carved, cruelly, into his own. Because Baldwin had leprosy. It had been discovered when he was a child. His tutor, the historian William of Tyre, first noticed the boy could feel no pain in his right hand. What began as numbness had progressed, as leprosy always does, into something far more devastating. By his mid-teens, Baldwin's fingers were beginning to curl and fuse. His face bore the subtle marks of the disease. His body, even in moments of relative health, burned with fevers that left him trembling. Any other young man might have retreated from the world. Many in his position would have surrendered the throne to a regent and lived quietly behind stone walls, waited for death that was certainly coming sooner than it should. Baldwin IV of Jerusalem did not have that luxury. And even if he had, those who knew him best understood he would not have taken it. Because Baldwin, despite everything, the disease, the fevers, the court intrigues constantly swirling around his legitimacy, was a king in the truest and most dangerous sense of the word. He had inherited not just a crown but a will of iron, a tactical mind sharpened by his illness rather than dulled by it, and a refusal to be defined by what was wrong with his body rather than what burned inside it. But in November of 1177, the kingdom around him was coming apart. The situation had begun to deteriorate months earlier, when Count Philip of Flanders arrived in Jerusalem on pilgrimage. Philip was powerful, well-connected, and ambitious, and he brought with him a plan. Baldwin and Philip together had been negotiating with the Byzantine Empire for a joint naval assault on Egypt. If successful, such a campaign would strike Saladin at his very source of power, crippling his ability to wage war in the Holy Land for a generation. It was, by every measure, a brilliant strategy. Philip of Flanders decided he didn't want to do it. Instead, he chose to join a separate expedition northward, a siege of Harim in Syria, led by Raymond III of Tripoli. Philip saw glory in that direction. Glory, and politics. And so the Grand Alliance crumbled. The combined fleet of Crusaders and Byzantines that might have changed the course of history was disbanded. Worse, and this was the detail that would nearly destroy everything, Philip took with him an enormous portion of Jerusalem's military strength. The Knights Hospitaller marched north. Dozens of elite Knights Templar rode north. A substantial portion of the kingdom's professional fighting men, the armored cavalry upon whom the entire military system depended, were now 100 miles away, besieging a castle in Syria that mattered far less than what was about to happen in the south. Baldwin was left with almost nothing. The chronicler William of Tyre, who was present and witnessed these events, wrote that the king could muster only 375 knights to defend the entire kingdom of Jerusalem. 375. The kingdom was, for the first time in years, genuinely exposed. Its flanks were bare. Its finest warriors were occupied elsewhere. And someone had noticed. The Sultan's gamble. In Cairo, Saladin was watching. His full name was Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, and by 1177 he had already accomplished something extraordinary. In less than a decade, he had transformed himself from a Kurdish military officer serving a foreign dynasty into the undisputed ruler of Egypt and much of Syria, the founder of the Ayyubid Sultanate, the most powerful Muslim leader the Holy Land had seen in a generation. Saladin was not a simple warlord. He was a deeply educated man, a student of Islamic law, a patron of scholars, a general who read history and applied its lessons with unsettling precision. He was also, when the moment demanded it, utterly ruthless. His campaigns combined diplomatic sophistication with overwhelming military force, and he had the patience to wait for exactly the right opening. In November 1177, the opening appeared. His intelligence networks, and they were extensive, told him everything he needed to know. The bulk of Jerusalem's fighting force was in northern Syria. Baldwin was ill, perhaps dangerously so, recovering from a malarial fever on top of his leprosy. The southern border of the kingdom, the vast coastal plain stretching from Gaza toward Ascalon, was defended by almost no one. Saladin mobilized with startling speed. His army assembled in Egypt and began the march through the Sinai Peninsula in mid-November, following caravan routes that kept them out of sight of Crusader coastal fortifications. The force he brought was enormous. William of Tyre, writing from the Christian perspective, estimated 26,000 men. Modern historians debate the exact figure, but the army certainly numbered in the tens of thousands. Mamluk heavy cavalry in their distinctive armor, Turkish mounted archers whose composite bows could punch through chainmail at distance, Sudanese infantry, Arab light cavalry, and Saladin's personal bodyguard, the elite Ghulam warriors in their yellow robes, the finest soldiers money and training could produce. They crossed into the kingdom of Jerusalem near Darum, bypassing the small garrison at Gaza, and poured into the undefended plains. What followed was not an invasion in the classical sense. It was a raid, a massive, sweeping devastation designed to bleed the kingdom of resources, morale, and people. Saladin's cavalry spread across the countryside in foraging parties, pillaging villages, seizing livestock, burning crops. Men and women were taken prisoner and would later be sold into slavery. The towns of Ramla and Lydda fell. The rich farmland between Gaza and Jerusalem was systematically stripped. And Saladin kept moving north, toward Jerusalem itself. He had one immediate tactical problem: Ascalon. Ascalon was a fortified port city on the coast, and Baldwin was inside it. The leper king, despite his illness, had ridden south the moment word reached him of the invasion, taking his 375 knights and racing to Ascalon before Saladin could cut him off. He had also sent desperate word to the Knights Templar garrison at Gaza, ordering them to break out and link up with the royal force. Saladin looked at Ascalon and made a decision that would define the battle to come. He didn't assault it. Ascalon's walls were strong, the defenders were determined, and an assault would cost time and blood. Saladin calculated, correctly, as any reasonable general would, that Baldwin was contained. The boy king was inside the walls with a few hundred knights. He was sick. He was surrounded. He would stay put. So Saladin left a portion of his army to keep Ascalon under observation, then pushed the bulk of his forces northward toward Jerusalem. The holy city itself was his real prize. If he could take Jerusalem, everything else was secondary. He never imagined what was already moving behind him. The decision that changed everything. Inside Ascalon, Baldwin IV was not sitting still. From the walls of the city, his scouts reported what Saladin's forces were doing to the countryside. Villages burning. People enslaved. The land his ancestors had fought and died for being stripped and desecrated, mile by mile. Some of his advisors counseled patience. Wait for reinforcements. Wait for the northern forces to return. Send messages to Philip of Flanders. Do not risk everything on an open field engagement against a force 10 times your size. Baldwin listened to these arguments. He understood them. They were not wrong, exactly. And then he made the decision that every historian who has studied this battle has described as some combination of brilliant, reckless, and divinely inspired. He sallied out of Ascalon. With his 375 knights, men who had ridden hard to reach the city in the first place, men who were not rested, men who knew exactly what the numbers looked like, Baldwin IV of Jerusalem opened the gates of Ascalon and rode north, shadowing Saladin's army along the coast. Simultaneously, the Knights Templar at Gaza, the Grand Master Odo de St Amand and 80 of his knights, broke through the forces besieging their city and drove south to link up with the king. The combined force was still desperately small. Approximately 500 knights, heavy armored cavalry, plus several thousand infantry, archers, spearmen, crossbowmen, mounted sergeants, and Turcopoles. Against 26,000. But they had one thing Saladin had not accounted for. He didn't know they were coming. Saladin's army was spread across a wide arc of territory. His cavalry were out foraging, raiding, ranging far from the main column. His troops were confident. Why wouldn't they be? The Christians were locked in their city. There was no threat on the open road. The Bishop of Bethlehem rode with Baldwin's army carrying the true cross, the relic believed to be a fragment of the actual cross of Christ's crucifixion, the most sacred object in the Christian world, which had been carried into battle by the kings of Jerusalem for generations. To the Crusaders, its presence was not merely symbolic. It was the difference between fighting as soldiers and fighting as instruments of God. Baldwin halted his army. He dismounted, with help, because his hands could not grip properly, and knelt in the dust of the road. His knights knelt with him. The bishop raised the true cross against the sky. And Baldwin prayed. He prayed, according to the accounts that survive, with total conviction. Not the performance of piety expected of a medieval king, but the genuine, desperate prayer of a young man who understood that what he was about to do was probably insane, and that only something beyond human calculation could make it work. Then he got back on his horse. The hammer falls. November 25, 1177. The feast day of Saint Catherine of Alexandria. The hill of Montgisard, near Ramla. Dry land, scrub brush, the distant shimmer of the sea to the west. The air smelled of dust and burning. Saladin's forces were preparing to cross a stream, paused, partially deployed, their cavalry dispersed across the surrounding countryside in foraging parties. The Sultan himself was present, along with his personal bodyguard, the elite Ghulam warriors. He had no reason to expect a battle. The Christians were contained. The road ahead was open. Then the horns sounded. The Crusader army came over the ridge at full gallop. What happened in the next moments is described in the sources with variations but consistent in its core facts. The charge was devastating. Hundreds of armored knights on heavy destriers, war horses bred and trained for exactly this kind of shock assault, crashed into the partially formed Muslim line with catastrophic force. The Templar knights, who had ridden through a siege to reach this battle and were perhaps the most ferociously motivated fighters on the field, struck the center with particular violence. Their charge was not a skirmish line but a wedge, a concentrated mass of iron and horseflesh designed to break formations, scatter infantry, and punch through cavalry screens before an enemy could react. Saladin's army had not rested properly. Their horses were tired from weeks of campaigning. His foraging parties were scattered across miles of countryside and could not be recalled quickly enough. His formation, caught mid-movement near the stream, could not absorb the impact. The center buckled. Saladin's nephew Taqi ad-Din attempted to rally the flanks and organize a counterattack. But the confusion was too great, the momentum of the Crusader charge too powerful. The Ghulam bodyguard, the yellow-robed elite, fought hard, standing their ground when others began to flee, dying in place rather than breaking. But even they could not stop what was happening. The Muslim army broke. Not a tactical withdrawal. Not a fighting retreat. It broke, dissolved into panic, men throwing down weapons and even stripping off armor to run faster, in some accounts. The rout was total and extended for miles, as the Crusader cavalry pursued through the afternoon and into the evening. Saladin fled for his life. The chroniclers record a detail that has lodged itself in historical memory because it is simultaneously humiliating and genuinely remarkable. Saladin, the great Sultan, the unifier of Egypt and Syria, the man who would one day retake Jerusalem, escaped the Battle of Montgisard riding a racing camel. His bodyguard was decimated around him. His nephew's son Ahmed was killed in the fighting. The jurist Dia ad-Din Isa was taken prisoner. The pursuit went on for 12 miles. By nightfall, Saladin's great army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. William of Tyre estimated that 9/10 of the army that had marched north so confidently was destroyed, killed, captured, or dispersed. Saladin himself would not reach Cairo until December 8, nearly 2 weeks after the battle. He arrived with the remnants of his force, haggard, his reputation in tatters, his grand campaign reduced to ash. On the field of Montgisard, Baldwin IV of Jerusalem stood surrounded by the wreckage of an army that had outnumbered his own by more than 50 to 1. He was 16 years old. His hands were wrapped in bandages. He was burning with fever. He had just saved the kingdom of Jerusalem. The cost of miracles. Victory is rarely as clean as the stories make it. The Battle of Montgisard was one of the most stunning military upsets in medieval history, but it had cost the Crusaders dearly. Roger de Moulins, the Grand Master of the Knights Hospitaller, reported that 1,100 Christian soldiers had been killed in the fighting. Another 750 returned home with wounds. Given the total size of Baldwin's force, these were catastrophic losses. Nearly half the army had been killed or crippled. The kingdom celebrated. It had to. After the terror of watching Saladin's army strip the countryside, after the desperate uncertainty of those weeks when Jerusalem itself seemed within the Sultan's reach, the victory at Montgisard felt, to those who witnessed it, like nothing less than divine intervention. Baldwin commissioned a Benedictine monastery to be built on the battlefield itself, dedicated to Saint Catherine of Alexandria, whose feast day had been the day of the battle. The construction of that monastery was his act of thanksgiving, his acknowledgement, in stone and mortar, that what had happened at Montgisard was not simply a military victory but something he believed his God had given him. In the Islamic world, the reaction was more complicated. Saladin was a man of exceptional personal resilience, and he understood propaganda as well as strategy. He moved quickly to frame the defeat at Montgisard not as a disaster but as a temporary setback, a test sent by God that had been survived and would be overcome. He commissioned chroniclers to minimize the scale of the loss. He communicated to his Syrian vassals, who had watched the defeat with alarm, that he remained strong, that his campaigns would continue, that the cause of Islamic reconquest of the Holy Land was not broken. Some believed him. Others were not convinced. The historian Ibn al-Athi, writing later, was more honest. He described Montgisard as a catastrophic defeat, one that so severely damaged Saladin's prestige and military capacity that it required a decade of patient rebuilding before he could seriously threaten Jerusalem again. Muslim chroniclers, writing in the years and decades that followed, developed a remarkable consensus. Saladin's defeat at Montgisard was so complete, so humiliating, so unexpected, that it was only truly redeemed, in the collective historical memory of the Islamic world, by his great victory at the Battle of Hattin 10 years later, in 1187, which finally broke the Crusader field army and opened the road to Jerusalem. 10 years. A decade of consequence, bought by a dying 16-year-old on a field near Ramla with 500 knights and a relic of the true cross.